Why is Brooklyn known as the city of churches? Well, it's pretty evident, especially when you walk around a neighborhood like Brooklyn Heights. There's churches literally everywhere. So we are going to explore the most dense neighborhood for churches in all of Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights, in the northern part of Brooklyn, also one of the oldest parts of Brooklyn. Here today, we're starting at Grace Episcopal Church. I'm Ariel, you're watching Urbanist, and let's explore a collection of 4 different churches, and we'll see some churches off to the side as well. Let me know where you're watching from, and let's go explore the churches of Brooklyn. So this is the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights. Many of you already know where Brooklyn Heights is located, but if you don't, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous neighborhood towards the north of Brooklyn, here right at the East River, where you can access downtown Manhattan via ferry or via subway. This is Grace Court, beautiful area here in this neighborhood. This neighborhood was also known as America's first suburb, because people started moving here in the early 1820s in order to escape the densely populated area that was quickly becoming dirty, which was at that time known as New York, was basically anything below Chambers Street. Thus, with that population moving here, they had to build their own churches. And the majority of the population that came here first were Episcopalians. That basically was the main religion for the aristocracy of New York. And this is the church they built in 1847. They hired a very famous architect who was born in England to a family who was involved in the clergy. His name was Richard Upjohn. Richard Upjohn is known most popularly for Trinity Church. Now this guy, known for building some of the most beautiful Gothic churches in the U.S. He is known, as I mentioned, with Trinity Church right over here, which is on Wall Street. And here's an older photo of Trinity Church. Now, the most beautiful aspect of this church, the way you could tell it's Gothic if you can see the pointed arches. But the other cool aspect of this church is the stained glass windows, made by one of the most famous stained glass artists in all of U.S. history, Louis Comfort Tiffany. Associated with Tiffany and Company, the store where you can buy beautiful jewelry and other amazing things and lamps. Louis Comfort Tiffany, the reason he's so kind of a huge icon in American glasswork was because he used a different method of making stained glass windows. He used different types of glasses. So let me show you the different types of glasses he used. This is a collection of glasses he used. So in any given stained glass window, he used rippled glass, plated glass, mottled glass, confetti glass, and marbled glass. For example, confetti glass was used as kind of nice, soft, tiny pieces of glass in order to accentuate the look of leaves or some type of foliage. So here we have an example of Louis Comfort Tiffany stained glass window. So let's take a closer look. Now the faces are missing. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe they're being repaired. You can see the faces, but they're already starting to be erased. Maybe they're being repaired, I think. Might be the case. Let's take a So let's take a look at the front of the church. The faces could be painted from the inside. That might be the case. Yes. Andy, thank you for letting us know. That might be the case. Now, it's much more impressive to see these stained glass windows from the inside. Unfortunately, we can't go in because a lot of these churches are closed due to the pandemic. Episcopalian churches usually just tend to be closed, period, only during service that they open it up. But we might be able to see one church, hopefully, crossing fingers. We'll see it from the other side. So keep that name in mind, Louis Comfort Tiffany and Richard Upjohn, because we're going to encounter them again. Now, the reason I want to show you this tour is because I walk a lot through Brooklyn. I love Brooklyn. I love Brooklyn Heights. I love many of the neighborhoods like Park Slope and Fort Greene and etc. The name list goes on. With all these neighborhoods, I've always noticed there's all these different types of churches, especially through Brooklyn Heights. There's like a church every single corner. And I wanted to look into the history so we can see what's up with these churches. Does Brooklyn really live up to its name? And spoiler, it does. So let's go to our next church. Let me show you here first front. Hello, Alexandra. Hello, Kay. Hello, Ronald. Hello, Andy. Kurihara. Hardeep, welcome. So you can only see, so you can see them only in the inside of the churches. Yeah, that's the deal with stained glass windows. Always with sirens in New York City. One of them is vaping inside the truck. There's a vapor in the truck because one of them was using the vape. So here on the side we have Grace Church School, established in 1928. One of the more prestigious schools to get into in New York City. Really long waiting list. Really kind of fierce competition. It is rumored that people sign up their kids before they've even been born to try to get into this school, Grace Church School. Roxanne, thank you so much for the $5 super chat. I appreciate you. Hey, Estanislao, welcome. Random question, do you have a favorite pizza in Manhattan? I'll be very brief. Joe's Pizza in Greenwich Village. All right, let's continue walking. So here, this was Grace Court and Hick Street. This is the corner of Grace Episcopal Church. Now, don't know what Episcopal is. This is the main sigil of the Episcopal Church. It is basically Anglican. It's just the American version of Anglican. After the American Revolution, we couldn't quite continue with the Anglican Church because that would have been just awkward, and hence we end up getting our own system, utilizing bishops from the Episcopal Church of Scotland. So here's Grace Church. Court. Alright, so if you're enjoying this video and so excited to see the other 3 churches, press that like button right now, slam that like button if you want to bring these videos to more people around the world that can use them. Many people can't travel for various reasons, maybe due to travel restrictions, mobility issues, sometimes there's financial limitations, and I'm happy to bring it to you to the comfort of your own phone. So if you want to make sure more people see these videos, slam that like button, and we'll bring New York to the world. Let me know if you're in Team Like. Hey, Milo was quick. He's already a Team Like. Here's the Bossert hotel, one of the big hotels built in this area. We'll talk about one of them a little bit later. Hey, Pedro, thank you so much for a €5 super chat. I appreciate you. Sean says, very cool glasses. Thank you. Hello, Jasmine. Look at the beautiful architecture. Got amazing architecture here. Team Love, just in time for Valentine's. Thank you so much. Colleen's and Team Like. Seija for freezing Finland. Equally freezing here. Hey, Billy. Nice. I'm doing well. Thank you. Hey, Kathleen. Thank you so much for 500 stars. I appreciate you, Kathleen. Sorry for the heavy breathing. It's sometimes on cold days it's and while wearing a mask it's a little bit hard to catch your breath. So here we're starting to see the skyline of downtown Brooklyn. That is the historic skyscraper district. But right in front of it, we see what used to be one of the tallest church steeples in Brooklyn Heights. Well, it was originally built in 1844 as the church for the Pilgrims. Now, this church has gone through quite a history. Because at first it was a Congregationalist church, mostly for New Englanders that were starting to come down here to New York City. Many of them descendants of Puritans who landed on Plymouth Rock. Hey, bored with this username. Thank you so much for a £5 super chat, Steve. I appreciate you. Debbie, what's the temperature here? Pretty cold. Pretty cold. Fotis, Brooklyn rocks. Yes, it does. Brooklyn does rock. Look at this. So this church, this is a depiction of how it originally looked like. The steeple was even bigger. I'm not sure why they took it down. That's actually a very good question. This was built in 1844. A few years, 3 years before Grace Church was built by the same guy, Richard Upjohn. And it had stained glass windows, also by the same guy, Louis Comfort Tiffany. Let me emphasize, Richard Upjohn, one of the most famous American architects. But there's a few secrets here. I wonder why so many churches were built. Great question. A lot of these churches had tiny little congregations. For example, the Church of the Pilgrims, I think, was around 200 people. So it was pretty tiny. Each of these churches did not serve a big population like you would see in maybe, say, Catholic areas, like in Rome or in Paris. So this started as a Congregationalist church called Church of the Pilgrims. Church of the Pilgrims still exists, and we're going to visit the last stop, that church. However, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a huge rush of immigration. People coming in from all around the world. But one place they were coming from, and from my perspective, it's a little bit of kind of a forgotten immigrant group. I think they assimilated so deeply, similar to the Irish. They were the Syrians. Many of the Syrians that came here, and then later Lebanese, were actually Maronites. And Maronites are part of the Catholic Church. They're in communion with the Holy See. They're just like a kind of like a different part of the Catholic Church. One of the previous popes said that the Roman Catholic Church is the right lung, and the Maronite Church is the left lung. They're both breathing in unison. So this ended up becoming a Maronite church later in its history. And one of its first major Monsignor Mansour Stevens was a huge antique buff. He loved collecting antiques, all different types of antiques. And he went to an auction of a great disaster that took place on New York City's harbor. That disaster was the fire and the destruction of the Normandy, one of the largest ocean liners to have ever sailed across the Atlantic. What was the Normandy? And what did he get from the Normandy? Well, first, let me show you this short. First, actually, let me show you the Normandy. This was the Normandy. Massive ocean liner bringing tourists and immigrants alike across the Atlantic Ocean. It was extremely lavish, filled with all the luxuries that you can ever think of. This was the dining room, and look how marvelous this dining room is. Wow. This is a poster of the Normandy, transatlantic ship. It was a successor of the Titanic, and much larger than the Titanic, actually. Almost as large as the Queen Mary. I think the Queen Mary beat it by just a little bit. But then the Normandy ended up becoming the USS Normandy. World War II took over. And with World War II, US commandeered the Normandy that was parked on the New York harbor. And they decided to convert it into a troop vessel, so they can send hundreds, maybe even thousands of troops across the Atlantic to fight in the war. As they were converting it into a troop vessel, a huge fire broke loose. It ravaged the entire ship. They tried to connect the fire hoses onto the ship to bring down the fire, but they had the wrong valves. The valves on the ship were French valves, and they only had US valves, and they had no converters. The actual architect and designer of the ship said, hey, try to just let the ship sink a little bit so the water could be put out by the fire could be put out by the water rushing in. And the US military refused. They tried to put out the fire nonetheless by using other methods. Didn't work out. The ship burned down, and then as it was burning down, it capsized into the Hudson River. For many years, it laid there, a burnt husk on the Hudson River. Let me show you a news.
Your commentator is Joe O'Brien. June 3rd, 1935. The Normandy, $60 million luxury liner, comes to America on its maiden crossing of the Atlantic, an event that occasioned a marine demonstration that will live in history. Whistles blew and sirens shrieked a mighty welcome to the new Queen of the Seas. The famed skyline of America's greatest city formed a fitting background for America's greeting to one of the most stately ships that ever crossed the Atlantic. 6 years later, shortly after the United States entered the war, the Normandy was seized and placed under naval guard. Hundreds of civilian workers were put aboard the Normandy, renamed the USS Lafayette, to strip the vessel of its costly furnishings and to prepare it for war duty as a United States transport. February 9, 1942, the Normandy afire. A fatal tragedy to the big luxury liner and to America. As the flames rapidly spread to devastating fury, workers madly scrambled to safety, while fireboats and fire engines poured tons of water into the stricken vessel. All fire doors, vertical and horizontal, were closed to protect the ship's vitals from the flames, but this was all in vain. Dense clouds of thick, acrid smoke billowed far out over Manhattan, casting a mucky pall over Midtown and downtown New York. While the blaze was at its height, Hundreds of doctors, nurses, and first aid workers were rushed to the scene to remove the wounded and to administer first aid to scores overcome in their efforts to stem the fury of the spreading flames. Millions stood in awe when the Normandy first reached America on its triumphant maiden voyage. Again, millions line the New York and New Jersey shores to sadly observe the passing of the doomed and ill-fated ship. Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, Commandant of the 3rd Naval District, was born man to shore to save the lives of those who were heroically battling to keep the huge liner upright. Hour after hour, tons of water were pumped into the Normandy, causing a bad lift to port, as strong hawsers snapped and tugs strove to push the giant vessel close to the wharf. Then, during the night, the Normandy met its final doom, when, with a resounding crunch of ice and a belch of smoke, the 83,000-ton vessel dipped her flame-scarred superstructure into the surface of the Hudson River. Hundreds were injured when America lost its biggest naval auxiliary. Millions of dollars of damage has been done, and thousands of man-hours of labor have been nullified. Accident or sabotage, the world may never know. But the fate of the luxury liner Normandy, rechristened the USS Lafayette, is one of the major catastrophes of our day.
So, the entire ship was scrapped many years later. It was a little bit of like a morbid tourist attraction to see the burnt husk of the Normandy. Monsignor Monsieur Stevens, who is the Maronite clergyman who led this church, later ended up becoming the archbishop, because this is no longer just a church, it is a cathedral for the Maronite Church. It represents 17 states. He ended up going to the auction. And at the auction, he bought 2 massive dining doors from the Normandy. This door right here are the actual doors that were on the Normandy. And there's one around the corner, which I'll show you in a bit. Now, these doors depict the Ile de France, which was another ship on the same company, and a few major castles in the Normandy region. Before I show you the doors even closer up, Monsieur Stevens also bought the captain's table, which a little bit further down at the rectory, the clergymen that are here now today still use and dine at the captain's table. And inside this church, there's a bunch of other amazing antiques. Let me show you the doors. So these doors were actually they came in a pair, and they were actually too big that they couldn't fit them together. So they had to split them up. And that's the Ile de France, that's one of the other castles. And the other castles. Now as I mentioned, here's Monsieur Stevens with the other clergymen. He's off over here. And here's Monsieur Stevens working on yet another project. As I mentioned, these stained glass windows used to be made by Louis Comfort Tiffany. But when Church of the Pilgrims united with Plymouth Church nearby, they took their stained glass windows with them. Stay tuned, we're going to see them. Thus, he had to make new stained glass windows. And he hired a famous French glass designer, Jean Corti, if I might be getting that correct, pardon my pronunciation, to make these very kind of unique, more modern looking stained glass windows. So these are made by a famous French artist in a different style from Louis Comfort Tiffany. And let me move to these ones so you can see them. Hey, everyone's loving this history-inspired life. W2M, hey, thank you so much. I'm so glad you are. Susie says, why weren't history classes so interesting? I don't know why. I asked the same question. The rectory is right over here. But then, this was actually a branch off of the original Marionite community. As I mentioned, the Maronites are Catholic. They just usually worship in the Syriac language rather than Latin. And they also they rearrange their services. But it's the same services, same sacraments, same communion, and everything. In Lower Manhattan, in modern day World Trade Center, there was Little Syria. That was the Arab center of New York City. This is a group of Syrian children, immigrants. Here's a baker, probably making baklava, it looks like it, in Little Syria. And this is more of the cityscape of what you would see before the World Trade Center was built. But just like our friend Robert Moses, the master planner, parks commissioner who ruled over New York City for decades, wanted to destroy this neighborhood in order to build the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, he didn't manage to do that here. They came into a compromise because the residents were much higher class, and they built the BQE a little bit further, closer to the waterfront. But in Little Syria, the immigrants weren't so lucky. They were much more poorer and did not have the resources in government in order to sway the desires of Robert Moses. So Little Syria was destroyed in order to make way for the Battery Park Tunnel and the rest of Battery Park. So all these Syrian and then later Lebanese immigrants were displaced. They had to find another home. This is kind of saddening as I learn about it because there's more photos online. Check them out. It literally looked like a really cool neighborhood, like a Little Italy or like a Chinatown, but for Syrians, for Arabs. It looks so cool, and I wish it was still there. A few of them did survive, and a few of them did linger after the Battery Park Tunnel. But then the huge construction project in the late 1960s was the World Trade Center, and the final of them were ousted out, including the church, the original Marionette Church of New York City, which was St. Joseph's. St. Joseph's was bought by the city, destroyed, dismantled, and then used for landfill. But then, September 11th, 2001. Many of you already know what happened. The World Trade Center was attacked. It fell down, crumbled into utter devastation. 1 year later, as they're digging through the rubble, the firefighters find something interesting. Something they did not expect to see in the rubble, especially so intact. Let's go inside the church. Let's see if we can see it. So here are the other doors. Here are the other doors of the USS Normandy. Beautiful work this one depicts churches in Normandy. Oh, let's go inside. I'll be quiet. So the church is closed, but I can show you through the window over here. Look at this. Look at those beautiful stained glass windows made by the French artist. They have a little bit like a star scene on the top. Beautiful. So the Syrians and the Lebanese are still here. And in the rubble, they found this. What is this? October 2002, in all of this devastation, they found the cornerstone of the original Marionette Church of New York City, St. Joseph, which was dismantled, destroyed, and used as landfill in order to build the original World Trade Center that was fully constructed in 1973. For some reason, this cornerstone survived the landfill almost intact, and it also survived the utter destruction of September 11th. A miracle. At least that's what many of the parishioners thought. Right here. It says right over here, cornerstone of St. Joseph Marionette Catholic Church, Lower Manhattan, founded in October 2002 at Ground Zero. Thousands of lives were lost. Let us honor and always remember. So if we actually go to the waterfront, we can actually see the views. If you were here in this September 11th, 2001, you would be able to see in very clear day, you'll be able to see the burning husk of the World Trade Center. The Monsignor of this cathedral at the time went outside and ran towards the Promenade, which is only 2 blocks away. He went down on his knees and prayed. He prayed as much as he could for each of the lives he saw that were being lost across the water. He might have been there for a few hours. People, other parishioners, saw him. He was praying and praying, giving them, in essence, their last rites, because he knew that there were fellow Catholics in there and there were fellow Christians. And he was also praying for all the people just in general. He was brought to tears when this cornerstone was brought over to the church. Broke down in tears when the firefighters came. 11 parishioners from this church passed away at September 11th. So it is quite a miracle that that cornerstone survived both major construction project and then later a terrible destruction of a terrorist attack. Quite a miracle. Wow. So this is the Our Lady of Lebanon Marionette Cathedral. Pardon if I said church a few times, but this is a cathedral. Established as a cathedral by Pope Paul VI, June 27th, 1977. Let's go to our third stop. If people are curious, Marionette Church is actually named after St. Maron, this guy over here. He was one of the people who continued the Christian faith in its very, very early days. I think it was about 200 AD, around there, maybe a little bit less. And he worshipped in secret in the area of Lebanon/Syria. Todd says, why did the cathedral survive? The cathedral actually didn't survive, just the cornerstone. It was the cornerstone of St. Joseph. The cathedral's here in Brooklyn. So this is Montague Street, the main thoroughfare of Brooklyn Heights. Thomas says, you like churches, don't you? Oh, yes, I do. I like any type of religious structure. I just happen to visit a lot of Christian churches here because we are in the U.S. and it's mostly Christian ones that are easily accessible. Sometimes synagogues. But I love all types of religious structures. I don't discriminate. To me, they're all fascinating. Debbie, thank you so much for the 50 stars. Yvette, thank you so much for tuning in. There's a Lebanon town in New York. Yeah, there's like a little Egypt, which is loosely associated with the Mediterranean / Middle Eastern community. Let me know if you also love churches, and press that like button. Let me know if you're on team like, if you also love churches and want to see more of them in Urbanist, not just in New York City but abroad. Maybe I'll revisit Rome and revisit those churches again, and maybe I'll go to other amazing cities like Paris. And let's continue going over here. So we see another church in the distance. So I mentioned, there's literally a church here like every block in this neighborhood. Wendy's always team like, Trisha's always team like, PowerPoint's always team like. Awesome, thank you. We got Tudor architecture. We got CVS inside old house. Will you ever consider going to the Vatican City? Asked Tyler. Great question, Tyler. I already have a few epic episodes of Vatican City. I went to the museum. I went inside the Basilica. I went outside as well. Check out my Urbanist bonus YouTube channel. There I have a few reruns of Italy, Paris, and also Puerto Rico. However, if you want to see more of the other videos, I have all of them on Facebook. So follow me on facebook.com/urbanistlive. Continue walking down. Cutest CVS I've ever seen. Yeah, agreed. Agreed. All right, so we are getting close to the other two churches. It's not so far walking distance here. Hey, Panka advises everyone to eat at the Iron Chef House for food right here in Montague. Thank you. Varline, thank you so much for the 50 stars. I appreciate you. I really like this area. Me too. Yeah, I love this area. It's beautiful. How about a tour of Electric Lady Studios? Maybe. I gotta reach out to them. With those places, I gotta get official permission. So yeah, I'll reach out to them. Penny says, yes, more churches, please. My pleasure. So here we have the Zion German Lutheran Church. As I mentioned, there's like a large variety of different types of churches. So while the original population here were mostly Episcopalian and maybe some Puritan / Congregationalists, then in the early 1900s, this started diversifying rather significantly. And with that diversification, it brought other different types of Christian denominations into this neighborhood. From Lutheran to Catholic, as we saw, to Maronite as well. There's also Roman Catholic here, to also Presbyterian. So this is the first Presbyterian church of Brooklyn, built in the 1946 by William Olmsted. And this one is also in the Gothic style. Lori, this is Brooklyn Heights. Yes, Lori. Yeah. So the Presbyterian Church, also associated with the Presbyterians in Manhattan, which you can find at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, is one of the more popular ones. I love the eclectic mix of churches and architecture. Yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Beautiful use of brick as well. Yeah, well, this is not quite brick. This is more brownstone. Yeah, it's a brownstone. It's a brownstone church. One of the few brownstone churches you actually see, I think. Well, there's a few. There's a lot. There's a lot of brownstone churches here. And these ones also have Louis Tiffany. Look at that. We have Tiffany once again. However, since this is Presbyterian, there is not so much iconography as with the other churches, as with the Episcopal churches. So Presbyterians don't tend to have too much kind of visual indications of the Bible or Jesus or Mary, unlike the Episcopals or the Catholics, or the Anglicans for that matter. What was your favorite area of Brooklyn? This is one of my favorites, but I usually love hanging out in Prospect Heights a lot. So here we have one of the more lavish. This used to be one of the grandest hotels in all of New York City, the Hotel St. George. There are denominations against iconography. Ask Rebel. Rebel, great question. So Protestants in general tend to not have iconography, religious iconography, because it is against many Protestant faiths to worship any type of icon. May it be a statue of Mary or saints. Usually it's looked down upon to worship to a saint, like you can do in the Catholic faith. Catholic faith, you can go to a chapel of, say, St. Marin or St. Bartholomew and pray to that person. In essence, you're praying through them, so you're asking them to pray for you to God. But the Protestants don't like that. They prefer you to pray directly to God or directly to Jesus. But this is oversimplification. There's a whole lot of details. So if anyone wants to get more into detail, do let us know. So the Hotel St. George was one of the grandest hotels of New York City. However, as I mentioned, a lot of immigrants started moving into this neighborhood. If you want to see a great movie that depicts the immigrant life here in Brooklyn Heights, check out the movie Brooklyn with Saoirse Ronan. And that film depicts an Irish immigrant in this neighborhood. So the prestige started leaving this neighborhood to the point where many people started knowing Brooklyn Heights as a slum. And with that, in 1908, many of the high-class residents started leaving in droves because the subway was built. And we all know what happens when the subway is built. People are scared that everyone's going to move here. And the subway was actually built right inside the Hotel St. George. The only entrance to the 2-3 station is here inside the subway. Is here inside the hotel. Now it's used as dorm rooms up above. We have like grocery stores. This is one of the more unique stations in New York City because you have to take an elevator to go down as well. It's the Clark Street stop. Teresa says the saints are intercessors for the faithful. Ooh, what does intercessor mean? Do let me know. So a lot of the original elements of this grand entrance to the hotel have been ripped apart, and it has just a mishmash of different elements throughout the decades. It's no longer looking like its original glory, but there's one tiny little part that survives. Right over here. So this is the original postal box of the grand lobby for the Hotel St. George, still surviving to this day. It is inactive, and someone actually wrote it here. Inactive mailbox, do not use. They intercede on behalf for the people. Oh, thank you so much, Steve. Rebel says within Islam there's also a divide on worship. Yes. It happens with every single religion. There's always differences or preferences of style of worship. So that was the 2-3 entrance for the Clark Street stop at what used to be the grand lobby for the Hotel St. George. Now they're NYU dorms and a mishmash of shops on the bottom. Ooh, we have a helicopter flying above. Here we see the dorms. Bet this hotel has fun ghosts. I think there is a ghost story associated with this hotel. I think there is. I think the NYU students have talked about it, but I don't know any details. Before we finish off, we have one more stop. I'll give you a coffee shop recommendation. I'm not going to go during this broadcast to keep it just about the history, but this is Vineapple Cafe. One of the best coffee shops here, and it also has outdoor heating seating, which is very great. And here we're starting to see some unique street names. Pineapple, we're going to see Cranberry, we're going to see Orange Street. What's up with those? Why do we have funny names like Pineapple, Cranberry, Orange? Well, for that we have to go back to the original residents, the 1820s. 1820s, there was already a Dutch family that lived here for many decades, the Middogs. And Lady Middog was not a fan of these new rich Episcopalians moving into their neighborhood and naming streets after their own families. She was like, damn those people. And every time they put up a new street name, she took it down and renamed it after a fruit. She kept doing that. And the town kept replacing them. And she kept taking them down and kept putting them on. Eventually, the town of Brooklyn Heights, then later becomes part of the city of Brooklyn, just gives up and decides, okay, we'll just let it be named after fruit. So here we have Orange Street. Now the terrible irony, I'm going to take off my mask because this street is pretty empty. The terrible irony of Lady Middog's crusade against the street names was that there is a street name after her, or after her family, Middog Street. It's like right next door. So look who's talking. She was maybe a little bit hypocritical, but I do like the fruit names. Those are nice. So, we mentioned before the Marionette Church. It was originally a church of the Pilgrims, a Congregationalist church. Congregationalism wasn't actually too looked fond upon here in New York City, so they had a tough time to even get started. And the original parish only had about 20 parishioners, a very tiny little group. But they they had their intentions. They wanted to grow nonetheless, as big as they could. So they end up getting that other church. But that other church, which was Church of the Pilgrims, end up combining later on, many decades later, with Plymouth Church. Now, Plymouth Church, that name might sound interesting. It tells us two things. It tells us where they came from, the people who started this church, from Plymouth, Massachusetts, all the way in New England, a little bit further away from Boston. And also, what's inside this church? Because there's a little piece of Plymouth. Let's talk about it. Hey, Cauliflower! I love your name. Every time I say your name, it feels like I'm saying a beautiful pun. And we have a vegetable pun rather than a fruit pun. Thank you again, Urbanist, for your historical walks like your mansion tour yesterday. I'm so glad. So many kinds of Christianism here. Yes, Kurihara, we do have a lot of different Christian sects in the U.S. and also in Europe. Kurihara, since you're from Japan, let me know. I know there's Japanese Christians, and they also are Protestant, a lot of them. I don't think there's that many Japanese Catholics, if I recall correctly. But let me know if there's different sects of Shintoism. I'm curious. Name of the church. This is Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims now. It's a combined church. Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. Hey, love from Hong Kong. Welcome, Chun. Nice to see you here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate you. So here's a bell that used to belong to another church nearby. And they removed it, put it back over here. And here we have the stained glass windows. These stained glass windows are yet again by our boy, Louis Comfort Tiffany. Oh yeah. Louis Comfort Tiffany strikes again here in Brooklyn Heights to also design these stained glass windows. But the interesting thing about these stained glass windows is that unlike most churches which they depict biblical scenes, sorry for the stumbling of words, they here depict historical scenes from the founding of our democracy. Specifically how the Puritans were involved in founding that democracy. And those are the stained glasses that we have here. When does this church date to? This church was actually established first in 1847 and then it burnt down and they just rebuilt it 2 years later. So this church is 1849, built by J.C. Wells. Are these windows protected? The entire neighborhood in essence is protected. I'm not entirely sure if the windows specifically, but the facade, since it is protected, most likely the windows are as well. So let's take a look inside. Well, we can't actually walk inside the church, but I'll show you a few photos of the church. So here are the windows depicting the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620. And here we have the organ. And Double R says, wow, you're highly prepared today. Yeah, I really wanted to do a history tour for all of you. So these videos are indeed researched heavily. So let me go a little bit further down here. We have the front doors, but it is closed. But can't walk in. Okay. The very first pastor of this church, he's depicted down there, was this guy, Henry Ward Beecher. Henry Ward Beecher was hired by the church. He lived from 1813 to 1887. He was their first minister. Henry Ward Beecher might sound very familiar because that name might sound like the name of a famous author. Yep, Henry Ward Beecher was the brother of one of the most famous authors in American history, Harriet Beecher Stowe. who end up writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is right over here. Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is her right here. This family was a staunch abolitionists. Abolitionists were people who were against the act of slavery, the institution of slavery. And they grew up in Illinois. They end up seeing slavery firsthand when they took short trips to the state right underneath Illinois, which I think is Kentucky. And they were utterly horrified by how terrible it all looked. Henry Ward Beecher had a penchant for the theatrical. He loved to be loud, to add extra oomph to his sermons. One of those ways was by making a mock auction, a mock slave auction. When he was little, he would see the slave auctions in Kentucky and be horrified by how they were selling human beings. A very terrible part of American history, a terrible part of many histories around the world. Thus, he ended up making auctions in order to free slaves. Now, I say within quotes because many of them were already technically free. The point of these auctions were in order to show people like, hey, we can do something to help, even if it's in this small way of buying their freedom. The most famous of these mock slave auctions was with a little girl by the name of Pinky. And Pinky was a mixed race African-American girl, and he collects a bunch of money. The auction goes all the way up to $900, and he takes a huge gold ring with a gigantic ruby on it, puts it on Pinky's finger, and says, "I wed thee to freedom." This was a huge sensation, so huge that the church felt so confident to reach out to a famous American politician who was quickly becoming popular, and there was rumors that he was going to run for president. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln ended up being hired to do a speech here in February, which was the middle of winter. It would have been very inconvenient for him to travel all the way here. He didn't officially run for president at that time, but he wanted to make a round of speeches, so he'll be sure to get the votes of people around America. There was a fellow New Yorker running against him, William Seward, who ended up later becoming part of his cabinet. William Seward was the front runner, so he was hired to speak here. However, so many tickets were being sold by the droves that they couldn't reach capacity. They couldn't fit everyone here. So Abraham Lincoln had to go across the East River and speak at Cooper Union, which was this brand new college at that time. Now, it's more than 100 years old. However, he did worship here twice, and it's the only New York City church that this guy, 16th president of the United States of America, worshiped at. Now, let me show you a little bit more of the garden. Let me move here. All right. So this garden was actually made by Arbuckle. John Arbuckle was one of the more famous, or one of the most richest coffee entrepreneurs of the late 1800s. He basically made our modern version of packaged coffee beans, which are packed and sold in vacuum sealed packages in supermarkets. He was the one responsible for that. He actually paid to make this garden. But there's something interesting here. With this statue, it depicts two slave women, which I think are slave women, right on his side. And it leads to something, a secret, right underground. Right underneath our feet is a massive basement. This gigantic basement right underneath this church, they found evidence that this was a place that was known as the Grand Central Depot of New York. But wait a minute. This is not a train station. There's no railroad here. Why is it called Depot? Why is it associated with Grand Central? It's not even that centralized. At that time, Brooklyn was its own city. not even in New York. Well, this was associated with a system of safe houses all around America called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad helped slaves from the slave states of the South. New York City was split in half. I mean, not New York City. The U.S. was split in half. Half slave states, half free states. But in the free states, if a fugitive slave was caught, he can be returned back to the South for a reward. If you were caught helping a fugitive slave, you can be fined up to $1,000 or have 1 year in prison. But Henry Ward Beecher and his cohorts took the risk anyway, and they set up a safe house here in Plymouth Church. This was the Grand Central Depot of the Underground Railroad. It wasn't underground, well, not fully at least, and it really wasn't a railroad, but it was a way to help slaves escape into Canada to finally find their freedom, to finally escape from bondage. There's still evidence of the Underground Railroad here. You can still visit the basement if you ever manage to take a tour of this church. Let's zoom in on the statue. And we have a depiction of Lincoln, yeah. And they have a marker for the Underground Railroad somewhere around here, but I can't see it at the moment because I can't walk in. It's currently a school. And we can see a little bit more of the stained glass windows here. But wait, there is one more final story associated with this church. In the 1860s, a group of parishioners end up gaining passage across the Atlantic Ocean in order to visit Europe, places like Paris, Rome, and then all the way into the Holy See, or Holy See, which meaning Vatican, to Rome. And then they later go into the Holy Land. Now, this is a gigantic trip for the 1860s. Nowadays, be pretty much not too bad. I've myself been to all those places in Europe and haven't gone to Jerusalem, but I assume it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But back then, it was a huge deal. They even went all the way to Odessa. But in this huge trip across Europe into the Holy Land, they had one young journalist on their trip. His name was Mark Twain. Mark Twain, many of you might recognize the photo. He is one of the most famous writers and satirists and stand-up comedians of American history. Yep, a young Mark Twain was joining along this trip with the parishioners of Plymouth Church. Now, as he was going on this trip, he was astounded by the cultural differences, the funny misunderstandings, the awkward moments between the parishioners and himself with the people that they would meet in Odessa or the Holy Land or Rome. And he ended up writing this huge, epic travel memoir called The Innocents Abroad. And Cauliflower, thank you so much for a $10 super chat. The Innocents Abroad. The Innocents Abroad ended up becoming a gigantic, massive success. It was one of the best-selling travel books of all time. But it was the second best-selling book of all time. Because Mark Twain couldn't beat Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, Mark Twain is the number 2 of this church. Thank you everyone so much for watching. That brings us to a conclusion of this broadcast. Let me show you a little bit more of the church. And if you have any last remaining questions, feel free to ask. Yes, his name was Samuel Clemens. I'm referring to him as Mark Twain. Thank you so much, Cauliflower. I appreciate you. Ariel, do you know if those stained glass windows have protected plate glass above them? I think they do. As we saw, I think they have some type of railing above them. So yes, these ones don't have plating glass because these, I think, this is part of the school. Yeah, it's part of the school. Great tour once again. I'm so happy you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Panagiotis. Ariel's book is the 3rd best-selling book. Maybe I'll get up to that level. Maybe. I appreciate everyone tuning in. We'll end with a view of the skyline, shall we? We're only a block away. So let's see the skyline for our epilogue of this epic video. So, endless gratitude for your walk, says the Inspire Life. My pleasure, Inspire Life. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you tuning in. Now, this is if you're new, if you've been watching my show only for a few months, you probably haven't seen too many history-centric videos because I've been taking a little bit break from history. I covered so much of New York City. If you want to see my older history videos of New York, there's a huge collection of them on Facebook. So put !Facebook in the comments if someone can put down the link. And there you'll get the link. Urbanist Live. You'll see a lot more videos. And when I travel to new areas around the world, you'll see more history videos as soon as I get to travel abroad. Just like Mark Twain. But maybe I won't be so innocent. Let's go and see the views. Let's end with the views of the New York City skyline. Maria says, wonderful and interesting. Thank you. Oh, the promenade. Where are you off to now? Says Nafla. We're ending at the views of the promenade. Karina, am I going to do something for Black History Month? I'll look into it. Yeah, I'll find a great story. There's many wonderful African Americans throughout her history that's had such a positive impact on our country. So, yeah, I'll look into it, especially here in New York. I called my son Samuel after Mark Twain. That's so cool, Terry. Oh, my God. Looks like a ghost town. It's because it's a residential neighborhood. It's during the middle of the day. People are at work. I love the history you cover. Oh, I'm so glad. From Buffalo, a town called Canada. One of the buildings has an Underground Railroad sign on the front. Oh, interesting. Chirag, I won't get into that. I don't think so, but I won't get into that question. There might be better articles that can answer that. There we go. Sharon, thank you so much for a $5 super chat. Thank you everyone who left PayPal and stars and support. If you love this show, want to see more videos like this, you can support here. And here are the final views of New York City. Wow. The city never disappoints with its history, with its architecture, with its people, and with its food. Everyone keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone. Milo, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate you. Have a great day, everyone. I'll be back.